So I guess it's my job to bring crypto into the Longevity in Crypto Day. The first thing, I'm going to divide this talk into two parts. I'll talk about the crypto side, but I do have some comments on the longevity side first. And I want to start here. One of the things that I think is important for everybody to recognize is that longevity as a field is really quite nascent. It's only been around, as we talk about it today, for about 15 years. A lot of the research that was done earlier was very foundational. We got into gene editing and things like that. But I would say it's probably around 2010 when longevity really started to come into its own. And that's good news because it means it's a green field. There's lots of opportunity. If you're trying to build your career, there's lots of opportunities to get into the field. And just to give you a bit of context, VitaDAO has a database where we sort of identified aging researchers. And we have about 1,300 worldwide. But when you compare that, say, to oncology, there's 25,000 researchers working in oncology just in the US alone. So that gives you a sense of scale. So I want to talk about the three current constraints on the development of longevity science. The first one is resource scarcity, the second one is incentive design, and the third one is leadership. And I want to start with, of course, the resource scarcity part. So I think everybody's probably aware that the National Institute of Health in the US is the largest biomedical funding agency, and their annual budget is around $25 billion. So, but if you look at it, the number of applications for grants has pretty much tripled over a number of years. But you have now only a 1 in 5 chance of getting funding from the NIH. And if you look at it from the perspective of aging, the NIA is one of the sub-agencies within the NIH, and unless you're doing something in Parkinson's or Alzheimer's, the chances of you seeing funding from the NIH is pretty much negligible, because that's where most of the funding goes. So, enter VitaDAO. VitaDAO is a community. It's a DAO. It exists online. We're held together basically by token ownership, which is the Vita token. And in the past 2 years, we funded 20 projects, and these are all early stage biomedical research. So these are principal investigators at universities, academics, or in private industry who want to do aging research, have an idea, but what needs to happen is they need to do some experiments, get some data, and de-risk their idea to the point where you can actually get VC investment to actually proceed to either spin it out as a company or proceed from there. And so the challenge with that, of course, is we're funding what's called the Valley of Death, because you heard probably, if you were here in the beginning of the day, that a lot of research goes to universities and it just stays there. It just dies on the vine. And it never sees the light of day. And part of what VitaDAO does is goes and finds that research and funds it, allows it to be de-risked, and makes it attractive for further funding. So again, a lot of our projects are, we sometimes hear the term moonshot, and VitaDAO doesn't really fund moonshots. It's actually a bit of an incorrect statement. We fund projects that have a translational aspect. And how do you determine that when you're talking about a PI in a university? You don't have the data yet. So our community actually consists of several hundred PhDs who actually look at these projects, evaluate it based on the science that they know of. And a lot of these are the people that you would see at most longevity conferences. So they participate by evaluating projects, giving feedback on the research, and it's done at the experimental level. So unlike a VC who comes in and looks at data and then makes a funding decision, we actually kind of incubate these projects. We take a PI who's got a good idea, we sort of help them develop the experimental plan. They might say, look, we want $250,000 to do this bit of research. We'll come to them and say, look, adjust your experimental plan to give you a better outcome. Have you thought about this problem? Have you thought about this another problem? Giving them more eyes on their experiment to get a better outcome. And so we say that we fund ambitious longevity ventures. It's true. but again, it has to be translational. Whoops. So I'm going to kind of tell you where we fit in the scheme. We are usually the first money in because we are dealing with a principal investigator who, quite frankly, might be just interested in the science. They may have never even thought about a commercialization plan or anything like that. So we're usually the first check in. Now, of course, that has the potential for the best upside. And for us, it's a closed loop system. Any money that we would make from an exit from research or an acquisition or any of that goes right back into our treasury. It doesn't go out to our token holders directly, although there's opportunities for our token holders to participate in the development of the research privately. But we actually just keep re-rolling that funding back into VitaDAO and redeploying it into new research. And so just to give you a sense, we actually have 3 types of projects. So the first one are your typical startups. And so we've invested in a number of different ones here. Some of these names you may recognize. We also have just recently started to spin out our own biotech companies. So for example, Matrix Bio is our first spin out with Vera Gorbanova working on hyaluronic acid. And that's one of them. And we have another one, Artan Bio, as well. And then on the crypto side of things, we have the IP, NFT, and IPT. So those are intellectual property NFTs, and the IPT is intellectual property tokens, and I'll describe those more in a few minutes. So just to give you a sense, you'll notice one discrepancy on the slide. It says 19 funded projects. I have 20 in the title. That's because just recently we funded Gero, which is here at the show, or here at the conference. So again, you'll notice that these are very small numbers relative to large biotech, but these are early stage projects. And so what happens is we will put in that initial check, we'll develop that data, we'll help them de-risk it, and then there are some other options as well. And what we're going to be doing this year, although it's not on any of the slides, is we're actually developing a sidecar fund to fund some of that next stage research. So it'll almost be like an angel fund for our own projects. So we've got a pretty diverse portfolio. We deal with most of the hallmarks of aging and what we call distribution of hallmarks of longevity. It's fairly evenly balanced at this point. Probably our largest singular investment is in epigenetic reprogramming, which is $1 million in Turn Biosciences. But generally speaking, we touch on most of the areas. Now, it's probably not a surprise that the distribution is heavily weighted towards the United States. A lot of longevity research, of course, is in 2 main clusters, San Francisco Bay Area and the Boston area, which of course is the Harvard-MIT cluster. So these are the sort of the distribution. And what we're starting to see now is as VitaDAO becomes larger as a community, we have currently 10,000 members. We're starting to get interest from Asia. We're starting to get interest here in the Middle East. So what we're starting to see is other researchers and other companies coming to us, and we're hoping that that'll start, evening out a little bit more. The things that we're focused on, so basically through our process of evaluating projects, we have a review team that looks at each of these projects. And so what we're looking for is a lot of novelty and a lot of relevance to longevity. One of the things that's important to us is, and I think Nicola actually mentioned it earlier, is that we're only focused on interventions that actually attack the root causes of aging. So we're not just interested in something to deal with a symptom. So the due diligence is very directly oriented towards making sure that we're actually attacking root causes. So here's some of our recent ventures. You may, as I mentioned, Matrix Bio, which is with Vera Gorbanova. We're going to talk a little bit more about Victor Korolchuk, which is autophagy, and this is using the IPT token model. Seclarity and AcceptGen are typical startups. So Seclarity is cardiovascular disease, and AcceptGen RNA platform development. So I talked to you about what you would think of as VitaDAO as a funding entity, but now I want to talk about some of the other things that we deal with. Because we're a community, because we have researchers, because we have biohackers, we have investors, et cetera. It's quite a wide tent, or quite a large tent. And one of the things, though, that we are very keen on is enabling researchers to advance their work. So one of the I'd say the golden thing that VitaDAO does is this incubation process, having access to hundreds of PhDs all in this space. And there's an interesting story, or an interesting sort of side part to this. If you were to go back 15 or 20 years, Pfizer, Roche, all the large biopharma companies used to have large R&D teams. They used to have hundreds of PhDs that worked for them directly. And it was very expensive for them. And then eventually they got out of that business. They had some very specialized teams, but what they did is they went towards working and basically becoming M&A companies. They just simply buy up small biotech companies and develop their assets that way. So one of the companies, or one of the groups that actually is supporting us, is Pfizer Ventures. And what was interesting for them was the fact that we were actually able to produce the same kind of output that they were producing 20 years ago by having these huge, massive teams and spending hundreds of millions of dollars. And we were doing it for basically next to nothing. And it was basically because we had the community model. Now you might say, well, why do you have a community? Well, we have a token. There is a benefit to them by having the ability to participate and help advance certain research. But it's at a fraction of the cost of what Pfizer and Roche and the large biopharma used to do a number of years ago. And this comes back to the concept of decentralized science. One of the things that's interesting in the crypto world is the ability, and this is why crypto and longevity actually fit quite well together, is the fact that both of these groups are into removing the middlemen, making it as efficient as possible to deploy capital and get results. So one of the things about decentralized science is there's a lot of silos of information. There's a lot of, if you listen to A16Z, profit-hungry intermediaries, as they call them. And the whole point behind decentralized science is to try to make sure that for every dollar spent, you get the maximum value of research. So some of the other things that VitaDAO does is we are helping on the open publishing side. Of course, if you know anything about academics, it's publish or perish is the term that's used. They need to get their articles in Nature and a number of these publications. But there's also preprint servers. And these preprint servers are there. And so what we have done is we've actually done an overlay journal called The Longevist. And every quarter, we have key opinion leaders within the community, and you can see some of them. These are people that are well known in the field who actually go through and evaluate these preprints and then vote on which ones have the most, are the most relevant. And so this is a way to get some peer review, but also to sort of elevate some of that research and make it known. So one of the other aspects is why should people care about Web3, blockchain, and DeSci in the context of longevity? So first of all, funding is a lot easier. It's much easier to raise money within the crypto community, mostly because the crypto community has a mindset of let's try it. They're not so risk adverse, whereas a VC is kind of sitting there and says, look, I have a portfolio, I have a thesis, I have to get certain returns. The DeSci world and crypto is a little more flexible that way. Number two is community. PIs can build a community around their work, and I'm going to talk a bit more about that in a moment. The other thing is data has financial value. So one of the problems in the current academic model is that if you do research and your thesis doesn't prove out, the data just doesn't support it, you don't have the chance necessarily to get that published. It means it's not going to help you with your career, it's not going to help you advance. But we've been able to monetize data that we are able to monetize the null hypothesis, which is actually kind of an important thing because that, even if data doesn't prove something, doesn't prove your thesis, that still has value. And so what we've done is we've made research into a whole new asset class, a direct-to-market asset class, which we'll talk about. And this comes back to IP NFTs. So if you want to think of a way, or think of what an IP NFT is, think that you have an asset that you're developing, and Pfizer walked up to you and said, I want to buy that asset. Well, you would have research data, master files, all the medicinal chemistry, all that information. And that would be a package that you would sell, including patents, etc. IP NFTs simply take that information, encrypt it, and put it on the blockchain in a way that is non-corruptible, and there is no question as who owns the assets and who owns the material. So now all of a sudden you have a research asset that can be traded almost like a bearer bond. It's basically whoever owns the IP NFT has the keys to access the data vault and get access to that information. So you have the ability to sell it all. And so we have a number of IP NFTs that we've developed. And the next phase is that we've developed intellectual property tokens. And the intellectual property tokens allows you to take an individual asset and offer tokens around a stakeholder community around that specific asset. So typically, you would, if you were an investor, you'd invest in a company that has the assets, and you'd have the whole aspect of the company. But in this case, in the blockchain, the asset, the drug asset itself, can be an independent entity. It doesn't require a company or anything with it. So, and you can have partial ownership of that. And so the first one we did is called the VitaFast token. And this is in direct connection to the Viktor Kowalczuk lab. And basically, we minted the IP NFT. We wrote that first check for Viktor Kowalczuk. He provided the data. And based on that data, we then turned around and said, okay, now we need to fund a bunch more information or a bunch more research, and we need to raise money. So then we issued tokens to the community and said, who would like to support this research? And we did it mostly as a first experiment. We're going to be doing a bunch more of these. But just as an example, we were trying to raise $35,000 for the next screen. And that screen, we went out and issued tokens, and we had 1,700% oversubscription from that screen. So we actually had $600,000 demand for $31,000 worth of tokens. So a couple of misconceptions. VitaDAO is not a VC. We act more like an endowment. And we have because of the way we do our research or do our evaluations, we actually have a peer-reviewed research design. So what is important about that is that when someone comes to us with a project, we don't just say yes or no. We actually try to help them improve their research as part of that. And sometimes a project will come in 1 month, and it might take 3 months, but we will continue to work with people to improve the research and then potentially write that check for them. There's a number of incentives for research. Part of it is having access to the community, having that extra peer review of the research or involvement. But also, they do have the Vita tokens. And the Vita token is a governance token that allows them to help vote on what research is funded. But it also it does exist on a secondary market. And of course, incubation and support through translation, because for us, it's all about being able to actually get things towards the market. So again, I mentioned we're basically exist to cross the valley of death, and that's kind of the way we view VitaDAO. One of the other things that we do a lot of is messaging and education. So if you were to go on our website, if you were to go on our YouTube channel, you will see that we do a lot of workshops. And again, part of it is outreach, both for the research community, but also to bring principal investigators and make their work known. We're here to promote them and help bring their research to the forefront. So it's very important to us to be visible and help do the outreach about longevity science in general. And this is an interesting statistic. So earlier this year, we did just a general survey about longevity science, and we asked people what they knew about longevity science. 74% of the general public knew nothing about longevity. They had no sense of it whatsoever. 26% did. But what was really interesting, and this comes back to a point from the previous panel, is that 14% of the people in the 74% of not aware work in medicine. These were doctors, nurses, people that are actually in the field that had no idea. So it's kind of interesting. So that's a little bit about VitaDAO, and thank you.
So now with Gary Gensler in the US going after crypto and NFTs and everything, how do you get around not being qualified as a security as you invest in others?
Excellent question. So first off, there's a couple of different things. So I'll talk about the Vita token. The Vita token is a governance token. There's no economic benefits. So again, it's a closed loop system. So we can take care of that in the US on that front. Now, when you come to the IP NFTs and the IPTs, that's a different discussion. So as you may know, Europe has adopted something called Markets in Crypto Assets, MiCA. That is the new regulations, and I have a fly that just will not leave me alone. And the MiCA regulations provides a framework for us to operate. So we're able to, so what we're in the process of doing is MiCA comes into effect in June of next year. Between now and then, we kind of have a grace period. And so we will be MiCA compliant. So we will be able to operate within Europe, no problem. We haven't explored Asia or Middle East outside the EU yet. Unfortunately for the US, we can't sell them in the US. And that's until the SEC gets a different mindset, we're kind of stuck. So it'll be Europe, it'll be the rest of the world, and hopefully someday the US will join us.
Hi. Firstly, thanks so much for organizing. But secondarily, I have a question pertaining to the fractionalized IP that's less so about the regulatory concerns. That concerns me very little. I used to manage a $2 billion private equity firm in the late-stage therapeutic space based in the Middle East. And we saw a ton of pushback from pretty well any large therapeutic firm in the acquisition of any IP with substandard structure. So even when we saw hostile universities when handling IP and spinouts cause odd clauses in their spinout terms, it would stop mid nine-figure and multi-billion-dollar acquisitions of companies we had sizable stakes in. I know you have the support of Pfizer, and I also know that Pfizer Ventures is substantially removed from the Pfizer mothership. Are you at all concerned that the science that you back can never be large-scale venture-backed or can never be acquired to the substantial range because of their concern with structure?
Again, another excellent question. The answer is we have in the design of the IP NFTs, we have the ability, and when we issue IPTs, there is legal terminology to allow for basically a drag along. So for example, even though if you were to purchase an IPT, VitaDAO still holds the IP NFT, and if a deal is so, for example, let's say somebody came and said, look, we want to acquire this asset, you would present that to the IPT holders. If they decided yes, then there's just language where you just pack up the IPTs.
But for example, a drag-along clause is standard in any common shareholder agreement, right?
Yep.
But even when these large therapeutics companies acquire mid-market cap companies, they expect 100% of common shareholders to have signed on to the shareholders agreement.
That's correct.
Or when there's kind of that black mark at the end of the deal closure, I've seen that stop large deals as well. So even a drag-along clause, I would imagine in the crypto context, you'd need every ETH address having approved the transaction. And even in the most active DAOs in crypto, Olympus DAO at its peak, you'd only see 32% voter turnout. Does that concern you at all?
Yeah, so I think it's a fair concern. I think that the way that we have it structured, it's a much larger conversation. The legal terminology and the legal agreements that go with it actually allow for that to be closed off fairly neatly because, to your point, it was brought up early on as something we had to deal with. So we spent quite a bit of time with lawyers on that.